thank you to Snedemo for welcoming us to the territory and allowing us to do business here. And thanks too to the organizers and really to all the folks in the room who made that FOPO report happen, because I think that's a very important document that could change things for the better here. So I manage Uu-a-thluk, which is the Fisheries Department of the chah Tribal Council. And we get our mandate from the Council of Hawi, the hereditary chiefs of the 14 chah nations. And our three primary goals are to increase fisheries access on behalf of our nations, to increase management authority, involvement in management, and then capacity, both human capacity and infrastructure, fishing fleets, and so on. I'm going to speak first of all to the experience in the chah on the west coast, and then I'll offer some broader observations. Before I start, I just want to get the R word out of the way, reconciliation. That's a federal government term that was adopted and used by the feds. It doesn't even become close to address the legacy of colonialism. And if governments were really serious about what they're calling reconciliation, they'd start by asking First Nations what they want to see by way of repairing the relationship, and they haven't done that yet. So we don't place a lot of stock in that. On the other end, if you want to look at UNDRIP, that does have some meaning. We welcome the legislation, and we'll see how it's implemented. There's still a long ways to go, but if you want to get a sense of what First Nations are looking for, that's a much better starting point. So, all right, in terms of the chah experience, we're talking about fishing communities here that go back thousands of years, where fishing is important in every aspect of people's lives and culture. And when commercial fisheries got going over 100 years ago on the coast, the chah participated extremely heavily. Starting in the late 60s with limited entry and then a succession of different policy initiatives, they got pushed out of the fisheries until by the early 2000s there were only a handful of fishermen left in that fishery making a living off of it, and I see several of them in this room actually. So the chah have taken on several different strategies to try and rebuild that fishing access in those fishing communities. And I'm just going to go through them really quickly. Can't go into depth with any of them, but just so you're aware of just the complexity of trying to rebuild fishing economies. First of all, asserting rights on the water. So you can call it protest or direct action or whatever you like, but getting out on the water and saying we're going to fish and risking jail time and so on. Second one is asserting those rights in court, going to court and fighting to get those rights recognized and going through all the appeals and just continuing that. And there have been several of those in our territories. Third one is by negotiating treaties. We have the Nulth Treaty, where you have fisheries rights guaranteed under treaty and therefore under Section 35 of the Constitution. The fourth one is by participating in co-management initiatives. We've got the West Coast Aquatic Governance Board, a process that goes back about 20 years. We've got salmon roundtables that deal with harvest as well as stewardship activities, and we're working with all the sectors and governments in these roundtables all across our territories. The fifth way is by relying on and lobbying for government programs. There's PICP. I saw some reps from the PICP program here in the room, from AFS, which is the Aboriginal Fisheries Strategy, which came out of a court case, incidentally. You see how these things are connected. Came out of the Sparrow case in the beginning of the 90s. And then ARM, which funds resource management programs, and that's how Uu-a-thluk is funded through the federal government. And the last one is by taking an entrepreneurial approach and building fishing businesses with Northern Channel Seafood Development Corporation is an example of that. So all of these strategies have pros and cons, and I don't have time to go into them in detail, perhaps in the breakout sessions afterwards, but I'll give you a few observations. First of all, it's really sobering, but they're very time-consuming. Every single one of these has taken decades to yield any kind of results. We're looking at initiatives, that started back in the 70s in some cases, and they're still just starting to yield results. So you have to be prepared for a long haul. And in that period of time, of course, you can lose a generation of fishers. So it's pretty problematic that each strategy pursued on its own can take so long. The second issue with them is that they can be very expensive, in particular litigation. It costs a fortune to go to court and stay there and go through all the appeals. And these are not wealthy communities to begin with. Third aspect of them is that several of them are technically complex and they rely a lot on outside expertise, lawyers, facilitators, consultants, and so on. And what they don't do is they don't build a lot of the capacity, a lot of the time. They don't build the capacity in the communities to keep doing this kind of work. And so they, just from an economics point of view, when you're paying that kind of money out, it's not staying in the community, it's leaving the community, going out to other places, right? And then another aspect is that some of these models also, they don't build back your fleets and your fishers. If you're leasing out quota all the time, or you're paying someone else to do your fishing for you, then you're losing an opportunity to actually rebuild the fishing within your communities. So that's the channel experience here. Just a few general observations. I'm really mindful of time, so I'm going through this pretty quickly. But, okay, first off, I would suggest to the room, to governments, etc., that you just recognize the authority of First Nations to manage fisheries in their territories. Just use that as the basis for establishing regional co-management regimes in the different parts of the BC coast. Now, I'm just going to say, I don't think top-down management systems are working. I think we just have to look around us at what's happened to our fisheries, and they're clearly not working. And there is a place for National Fisheries Management Agency, national standards, national expertise, resources, and so on. But we've been talking about the potential for regional co-management in this province for at least 30 years, and I think we need to have a serious move towards that. And a good starting point for that is to recognize authority of First Nations as governments in their own territories. Right on. Second thing is, stop going to court or stop forcing First Nations to go to court to establish their rights to participate in commercial fisheries. It's unjust, it's counterproductive, and it's a waste of government and societal resources. I'm going to suggest that you just recognize the general right of First Nations to participate in commercial fisheries and use that as your starting point for overhauling the licensing system, the allocation system, and access. Now, I'm going to just give a little hockey analogy here, right? Because to me, it's self-evident that every First Nation in BC fished commercially before the settlers ever showed up. They fished for trade. It doesn't seem to me that that's something that even has to be proven. And it's kind of like going out to every small town and village in Canada and saying, prove to us that hockey matters. So you get there and you figure out, okay, we got a local rink, right, and we got a local team, and we volunteer, and we send our kids, and you document all that to prove something that everyone knows is the truth, right? So we could stop wasting a lot of time if we just recognize that right there. Another thing we can do is First Nations are exploring some creative ways to try and raise revenues. A lot of the reason why First Nations can't rebuild their fisheries is they don't have access to revenues. They don't have taxation powers. So we're, like in Lopit territory in Clackamas Sound, we're looking at some ecosystem services, some fees that will allow guardian programs to operate, and fisheries assessment and restoration and so on. But we need a really serious way to look at how fisheries can generate revenues that go specifically to the fisheries in their regions, right? So start thinking about those things and work with people that can make them happen. Fourth thing, and it really should have been first, is that we have to recognize the ecological crisis we're in and make sure that every single conversation we have starts with the question, not what can fisheries do for me, but what can we do for the fisheries and the ecosystems? Because frankly, we're a science program, we're out on the fields, we're out in the field, in the streams and creeks all through the year, and what we're seeing is absolutely horrendous. Fisheries are collapsing all over the place. We may well be the generation that presides over the extinction of quite a few of our fish stocks, and that's a terrible thing to do. We have, I'll just very briefly, we have something that we're working on to protect the last bit of old growth habitat in our northern and channel territories, to protect it from logging, and to allow natural processes to rebuild those areas so that they stay salmon habitat. And the kind of time frames we're talking about are hundreds of years, but that's okay, because if that's what it's going to take, that's what it's going to take. So some of that habitat work is very long term, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be starting on it right now. Fifth idea, bring back small-scale multi-species fisheries. One of the biggest reasons that fisheries have ceased to be viable for small-scale operators on this coast is because they're forced into an extremely divided, particularized licensing and gear regime. So bring it back so that fishers can actually fish all year round, fishing multiple species, and diversify their risk that way, and you'll see a lot more success with fishers. You can diversify harvest impacts on fisheries by being more careful about mixed stock fisheries. Ocean fisheries, terminal fisheries can both coexist, but we have to recognize that mixed stock fisheries out in the ocean have had some really serious impacts on smaller stocks, and we need to rebuild a lot of those smaller local stocks. We do a lot of science towards that effect, but we need better science for stock ID. We need better data on post-release mortality so that we can be more selective and know what impacts are when we throw fish back in the water. And we need to use enhancement very carefully, because you can have some really bad effects on stocks if you just enhance willy-nilly, no think about it. One last thing, involve youth and young people and young fishers in this from the get-go. Ask them what future they see. They need to visualize. I really liked whoever it was who was talking about, it was you, Paula, about helping people visualize a shared future, right? People need to see themselves in that fishery in the future. And we need to listen to young people about what they see for the fishery. It's not going to be the same as the fishery you guys, the older guys, grew up with. It's going to be different, and they need to define what that's going to look like. So that's all the things we're trying to do through our. Thanks.
All right, thanks very much.